The Bully is a beloved classic SpongeBob episode due to the fact that it is chock full of hilarious jokes and moments. However, if you are able to set aside the episode's humor and look at its story and lesson, you might notice how it failed to properly address its subject matter. And years later, a more modern SpongeBob episode might have actually done a better job. Chapter 1. The Bully. So, the story structure of The Bully sees SpongeBob try and fail to mitigate a threat by a fellow boating school classmate who wants to kick his butt. The thing that this episode succeeds in the most is, bar none, its comedic elements.
Hi, SpongeBob. I'm gonna kick your butt.
And I think that these iconic moments of the episode are why The Bully has stood the test of time.
I just gotta act natural.
Oh, that's real nice.
While some other classic SpongeBob episodes with less than stellar lessons like I'm with Stupid or Dumped get criticized. It's a lot easier to see how needlessly cruel Patrick and his fake parents are to SpongeBob when the jokes aren't that funny. It's a lot easier to feel worn out by the manufactured drama of Dumped when the humor doesn't land. But with The Bully, it's a lot harder to see how poorly this episode handles the incredibly delicate subject of bullying through violence because the episode as a whole is just so darn hilarious.
Can't you see he's gonna kick my butt? Hi there, young people.
So, you like kicking butts, do ya?
But what exactly does this episode get wrong? Well, at the beginning, it starts off pretty strong, showing us how Flats the Flounder, the titular bully, chooses SpongeBob as his bullying target for seemingly no reason. Just like how a real bully will pick out who they deem the weakest as their target. The opening scene does a fantastic job of showing us how SpongeBob can be a little bit annoying at times, sure, but definitely not deserving of what Flats is dishing out. So SpongeBob tries to get help from a few different people around him. He first asks Patrick for help, only to find out that Patrick is actually friends with Flats, which is something that really could happen to an actual bullying victim in this situation. However, I don't think the episode really engaged enough with the situation of your friend being friends with your bully. SpongeBob just kinda runs away after finding out Patrick and Flats are friends, with no further questions. I don't think it was a good choice by the writers to play this whole thing as a misunderstanding, because that is not what a real bullying victim would experience. In such a situation, your friend who is friends with the bully doesn't not help you because they don't know about the situation. What would really happen is that the friend who is friends with the bully would take the bully's side, either because they're not a true friend or because they're afraid that they'd be the bully's next victim if they didn't. Obviously, this doesn't apply to every situation like this. I'm sure there's lots of people out there who were bullied and their friend was friends with the bully, but their friend took their side and stood up for them. You know, there's a lot of different situations, but I'm just talking most of the time in a situation like this, that's the power dynamic at play, and the episode didn't really address that. I understand it would be difficult to portray these more realistic scenarios using Patrick because of the pre-established relationship between SpongeBob and Patrick. Sure, there are some times where Patrick isn't a good friend to SpongeBob, but I think him outright taking Flats' side in this scene is something the writers would not have allowed, as it would have sullied our view of Patrick as a character. So they instead took the misunderstanding route that allowed Patrick to both be friends with Flats without him actually having to take a side. But while they preserved our perception of Patrick as a character, they sacrificed actually teaching the lesson about the nuance of this situation. They either could have been braver with their portrayal and presented Patrick as more of a bad friend, either through him outright taking Flats' side against SpongeBob, or showing Patrick being too afraid of Flats to stand up to him. I do think the latter would be more in character for Patrick than the former. Or they could have cut Patrick from the episode entirely and introduced a boating school friend of SpongeBob who only appears in this episode that they can have be a worse friend to SpongeBob than Patrick could be. Next, SpongeBob asks Mrs. Puff for help, but she fails miserably to mitigate the situation because she believes Flats' clearly made-up excuse. So, a point in this moment's favor. This is an accurate situation. I bet a lot of kids who were bullied growing up who watched this episode related to this. They probably had this exact conversation with their useless teacher. but I still think this was a bad inclusion in the episode, because a bullying victim watching this episode might assume that the authority figure in their own life is going to act like Mrs. Puff when they otherwise might have helped the situation. I think the reason this moment in the episode comes off so clunkily is because SpongeBob is the protagonist of the episode, not Mrs. Puff. See, if this episode was centered around Puff, then this moment could be seen as her own shortcoming, and the episode could revolve around her learning to handle the situation better. But that would basically be a whole different episode about how to handle bullying from a position of authority, which wouldn't be a particularly helpful lesson for the target audience of this show. The episode instead focuses on SpongeBob, the victim of the bullying. And I think this episode illustrates just how difficult it is to write a protagonist who is the victim of anything. It's not impossible. Obviously, many great stories revolve around protagonists who are victims of another's malice, but the reason writing a victim as the protagonist is so difficult is because the protagonist of a story is someone who has to overcome a character flaw and learn how to grow and change in order to deal with a situation. The problem with a protagonist being a victim is that almost always when someone is a victim of something, it isn't their fault. So, that opening scene that did such a good job of illustrating how SpongeBob is not deserving of this bullying is now working against the story of the episode. Because since SpongeBob didn't do anything wrong and his flaws are not the reason for the bullying, there's no way for him to grow and change. And because of that, we get stuck with this moment where the episode wants to criticize the system, wants to criticize people in power who failed to address bullying, but it can't do it properly, because the person in power is not the subject of the episode's criticism. The victim is, and the episode obviously doesn't want to criticize the victim, so it ends up criticizing no one. So then there's a scene with Flats' dad where SpongeBob finds out that Flats actually has power over his own father.
Now he's gonna kick my butt!
Similar to the last moment, it doesn't properly engage with the deeper social reasons as to why this happens. Sure, it shows us how a parent can be unable to control their kid, which leads to them becoming a bully, but beyond that, it doesn't have much commentary about what SpongeBob, the bullying victim, should do. When Flats gets hurt while chasing after SpongeBob, SpongeBob himself saves his life, only to find out that Flats is still gonna kick his butt even after all that. Look, all of these moments are really poignant social commentary. Your friend being the bully's friend, the teacher being useless, the parent having no control, the bully still wanting to bully you even if you're nice to them. All of these things are real situations that could happen and are worth addressing. But what the episode is completely missing is a good lesson regarding what our protagonist should do to deal with these social issues. And in the final scene, it finally tells us what we should do. And it's nothing. Seriously, that is the conclusion to this episode. Flats tries to punch SpongeBob, and it doesn't hurt because SpongeBob is a sponge. Okay, thanks for the advice. What if I'm not a sponge? Like, is this trying to say to just take the beating and ignore it? Because that's not good advice at all. It actually, hurts a lot to get punched, you know? And I think every single person who ever watched this episode is not made out of spongy material. I think they're made out of flesh and bones and nerves that would not enjoy being punched. So I'm just asking, who is this lesson for? Maybe, just maybe, the punches are supposed to represent bullying in general? Like, the punches aren't really punches, the punches are just Flats saying mean stuff, and if you ignore the mean stuff, you don't give the bully power over you. Problem is that fists punching someone is a thing that can really happen. So when I see it happen on screen, I don't think of it as representing something. I just think of it as, a fist. Oh yeah, and then Flats dies and SpongeBob gets blamed. What lesson is that trying to teach? If you let someone beat you up, they can't if you're made of a sponge, but then they'll get tired and pass out and then you'll get in trouble anyway. Again, it's easy to not notice how bad this ending is because we're all distracted by how funny it is that Mrs. Puff says she's gonna kick SpongeBob's butt. But when you really look at this story and what it's trying to say, it all just falls flat. No pun intended. Chapter 2. One Size Fits All. The issue of bullying through violence is incredibly difficult to properly address, especially through the eyes of telling a victim of such violence how to deal with it. It's sad to say, but in the situation the episode showed, where just about no authority figures are there to help the victim, the only real course of action is to fight back, which is not only a message that would be bad PR for a kids show, but also might not be possible if you're that much physically weaker than your bully. And sure, the episode does do a good job of criticizing the system, and maybe that's kind of the point of the episode, to show that the system has failed, to show that it's not your fault if you're bullied. In that way, it succeeds just a little bit as a narrative, but that's not enough to forgive the downright harmful advice of not trusting teachers and just letting the bully put their hands on you. I think the main issue with a story like this is that there is not a one-size-fits-all solution to this problem. Bullying is complex. The reasons why it happens, the reasons it is not properly dealt with. Each individual situation has countless possible variables that make it unique. This does not vibe well with a show like SpongeBob, where its episode plots usually revolve around broad ways to act in a certain situation. Take, for example, the lesson of the episode Wet Painters, where SpongeBob's own paranoia about screwing up a painting job ends up being the thing that makes him screw it up. It's a one-size-fits-all message about staying calm in difficult situations, even when the stakes seem high. While in real life, it's unlikely you'll find yourself in the exact situation SpongeBob was in Wet Painters, needing to paint your boss's wall and accidentally getting paint on his first dollar. You can apply the lessons learned in this situation to just about any remotely similar situation that you are in. Which, by the way, I did a video all about Wet Painters if you want to hear more about that episode. A link in the description. What makes the bully's lesson so different from the lesson of Wet Painters is that for the bully to resonate with you, you would have to get stuck with a very specific set of circumstances with all these other people in your life failing to help you with the problem. And that is just not a one-size-fits-all lesson. And if you're watching it and there might be other people in your life who could help you, you'll get confused thinking it's a one-size-fits-all lesson, and you might find yourself distrusting those other people. That's the main problem I have here. In many situations, your friend does stand up for you, the teacher does help, the bully's parent does put them in their place, and this episode only tells you what to do if all of those things fail, and it might even convince you that those things are going to fail if you even attempt them at all, which could lead to you not trying. And even beyond all of that, it doesn't even give you good advice for if those things fail in the first place. Perhaps this particular story shouldn't have even been attempted. Perhaps an 11-minute SpongeBob episode just wasn't the place to address the concept of bullying through violence. The episode probably would have been better off either focusing on verbal bullying, which would have made the just ignore it lesson actually work, or focus the episode more around Mrs. Puff and had a lesson revolving more around how to navigate bullying through talking to your teacher. Neither are ideal, and you lose out on some really funny moments like,
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
but anything is better than telling a victim to just take it like a sponge. Chapter 3. Bulletin Board. Bulletin Board is an episode of SpongeBob from Season 9 that is clearly an allegory for social media-based bullying. I hesitate to call this modern SpongeBob because this episode is actually almost 10 years old at this point, but I don't know. It's all HD, the characters are all springy, it has bubble bass, I'll count it. Bulletin Board revolves around a bulletin board in the Krusty Krab where people write little posts. Get it? At first, there's a lot of positivity, but as soon as people start getting anonymous, the toxicity spreads. The conflict begins with an anonymous post that is actually from Patrick, where he says something bad about Krabby Patties, which he didn't intend as bad, but it came off that way due to how it was written, illustrating how difficult it is to understand what people mean when you communicate through posts. Especially when you're kind of dumb like Patrick is, and like most people online are. Bulletin Board also does a good job at showing the contagiousness of negativity. After Patrick's anonymous post is seen as negative, the floodgates of negativity open, and now everyone starts being nasty. This is best illustrated during a montage of meanness where someone comments negatively on a drawing made by Pearl. Earlier in the episode, when Pearl first posted her drawing, people were kind and encouraging to her about it. But now that anonymity and negativity are normalized, they're cruel to her. The episode offers a pretty cogent look at how negative vibes through social media can spread quickly and easily, with the episode's ending even offering some decent advice on how to deal with such negativity, being that Krabs takes everyone to a knitting class, representing how you can escape from the amalgamous negativity of social media, the bulletin board, by engaging in an actual human activity with friends. To compare this to The Bully, I can see that Bulletin Board had a bit of an easier time communicating its message, just by virtue of Bulletin Board not being about violence-based bullying. Since Bulletin Board revolved around verbal and cyber-based bullying, it was able to present a more nuanced, one-size-fits-all conclusion, and help teach lessons that would be valuable to the show's target audience. And it's also just easier for kids shows to talk about verbal-based bullying rather than violence-based bullying. You just have to be a little more sensitive about violence. It just kind of comes with the territory. And now that I think about it, maybe that's why The Bully is such a funny episode. Because The Bully is about violence-based bullying, the writers needed to overcompensate for how touchy of a subject it was. So they ended up just being really funny. But on the subject of humor and Bulletin Board, it's actually a pretty funny episode. Is it as funny as The Bully? No. But because Bulletin Board succeeds at telling a proper story with a good lesson while still offering a solid amount of laughs, I would actually consider it the better episode of the two. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider supporting my Patreon or becoming a channel member. Also, check out my gaming channel where I'm going to be covering even more of the SpongeBob video games real soon.